What if your only way out of a miserable marriage was a sword fight? What if asking for a divorce meant being dragged to a public square, stripped of your dignity and your titles? And what if your husband could legally imprison you in a tower and no one would come looking? Welcome to the medieval world of marriage, where love was rarely the point, and divorce, that was a scandal punishable by shame, exile, or even death. In this video, we'll take you into the darkest corners of medieval society, where unhappy wives were locked away, husbands used religion as a weapon, and the church made escape nearly impossible. This isn't just history. It's a horror story with real people, real heartbreak, and real consequences. So sit back, because by the end of this journey, you'll never look at happily ever after the same way again. Before we begin, if you value powerful, untold stories like these, stories of women silenced by history, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Now, let's open the doors of the medieval marriage prison. Before we can understand the horror stories of medieval divorce, we must first understand what marriage meant in the Middle Ages. It was not love. It was not companionship. It was a contract. A legally binding, spiritually enforced, politically motivated contract. You did not choose your partner. You were assigned one. Your parents arranged it when you were a child, sometimes when you were still an infant. It didn't matter if you were a noble or a peasant. Love rarely entered the equation. In fact, if you fell in love with your spouse after marriage, it was considered a lucky accident, not an expectation. Marriage was permanent, and it was a prison, especially for women. The church, which held ultimate power over society, declared marriage a holy sacrament, a divine bond, an unbreakable union in the eyes of God. And once that union was made, it could not be undone. There was no divorce as we know it today. You couldn't just walk away. You couldn't file papers and split the property. There was no irreconcilable differences. Marriage was for life, even if that life became unbearable. The Catholic Church dictated the rules of marriage and enforced them with terrifying consistency. Theologians like St. Augustine preached that sex, even within marriage, was only justifiable for procreation. Pleasure? That was sinful. Mutual desire? Suspicious. A wife was expected to submit to her husband's will, emotionally, financially, sexually. If a man was cruel, drunk, or violent, the wife had to endure. If he left for years on crusade and never returned, she had to wait. If he refused to support her, or slept with prostitutes, or infected her with disease, it didn't matter. She was still married, still his, still bound. Medieval marriage wasn't just spiritual, it was sexual. A union was only considered valid if it had been consummated. In other words, you had to prove that sex had occurred. If a woman claimed her marriage was never consummated, she might have to submit to a humiliating examination by church authorities, or worse, testify in graphic detail in front of a tribunal. And if a man couldn't perform, it was a scandal. But even impotence wasn't enough for an annulment without extreme proof, and even then, only the lucky few won their case. Women were expected to bear children, again and again, often until their bodies broke. A woman might spend 2 decades of her life pregnant or recovering from childbirth. If she failed to produce a male heir, she was often blamed and shamed, no matter the truth. But if a woman wanted out of this prison, the church said no. Society said no. And even her own family might say no. Because marriage was also about alliances and money. Breaking a marriage meant breaking a family contract. It could ruin land deals, destroy noble bloodlines, and trigger feuds. In many cases, a woman asking for a separation was treated as a traitor. To her husband, to her family, and to God. Now imagine the psychological toll. To be trapped in a marriage with no love. To be beaten, silenced, betrayed. And to know there was no escape. No rights, no lawyers, no second chances. Some women went mad. Others became celibate within marriage. A few took the ultimate risk and tried to run, but most simply endured, waiting for their husbands to die, or for themselves to wither away first. This was the world of medieval marriage, a prison with no doors, built by faith, enforced by law, and accepted by nearly everyone, except the women who suffered inside it. And for those who dared to fight it, their stories were terrifying. Some women in the medieval and early Renaissance world dared to love on their own terms. And for that, they paid a price so severe, it reads like a fairy tale twisted into a nightmare. This is the true story of Marguerite de la Roque, a noblewoman who was punished not with prison, but with something far worse: isolation. The year was around 1542, and though the Renaissance had begun to spread across Europe, much of the world, especially the colonies, still operated under the brutal codes of medieval morality. Marguerite was born into a powerful French family, the House of La Roque, tied by blood to nobility, wealth, and the heavy expectations of class. She was raised in luxury, but also in strict obedience to family honor, religious piety, and one unshakable rule: never bring shame to the bloodline. But Marguerite fell in love, and that was her first mistake. We don't even know the name of the man. That's how little history valued him. Some say he was a gentleman of lower status. Others call him simply a passenger. What we do know is this: Marguerite boarded a ship headed to the New World, part of a colonization voyage organized by her own relative, Jean-François de Roberval, who was the Lieutenant General of New France. During the long sea journey, Marguerite and her lover shared stolen moments, secret touches, quiet laughter under the stars. And then she became pregnant. In the eyes of her powerful uncle, this was not just a scandal. It was treason. She had betrayed her class, her name, and her body. And so, Roberval did what no uncle should ever do. He abandoned her. The punishment was medieval in every sense. Off the coast of modern-day Canada lies a barren piece of land, once called the Isle of Demons. It was feared by sailors, whispered about in superstitions, said to be haunted by evil spirits. That's where Marguerite was left to die. She, her lover, and her maid were all put ashore with almost no supplies. Pregnant and terrified, Marguerite watched as the sails of her family's ship disappeared into the horizon, leaving her on a freezing, desolate wilderness, surrounded by wolves, starvation, and the cries of the wind. She gave birth alone. Her child died. Then her lover died. Then her maid. Only Marguerite remained, surviving off what she could hunt, wearing animal hides, defying death in the harshest landscape imaginable. She lived like this for 2 years. Let that sink in. A noblewoman, raised in silks and prayers, eating roots and meat torn from wild beasts, alone on a haunted island because she had loved someone her family didn't approve of. Eventually, Marguerite was discovered by Basque fishermen who brought her back to France. She returned, not in disgrace, but in eerie silence. Her uncle, incredibly, suffered no punishment. He continued his political career. No one held him accountable. But Marguerite's story spread. It fascinated Europe. It was told and retold in travelogues, letters, and court gossip. She became a myth, a survivor of a punishment so cruel it bordered on the demonic. And yet, she never married again. Her surviving years were quiet, lived in reflection, and perhaps in mourning for the love and child she lost. She had escaped the island, but she would never escape the judgment of her world. Marguerite's story wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was a message. In a world ruled by family honor, church authority, and male control, a woman's desire could be punished with exile. Her womb could seal her fate, and love, simple, reckless, human love, could become a death sentence. We often imagine divorce today as a legal process. Unpleasant, yes, but manageable. Paperwork, lawyers, court dates. But in the medieval world, particularly in parts of Germany, Switzerland, and Central Europe, some divorces were settled not in courtrooms, but in battlefields. This wasn't metaphorical. This was literal trial by combat, a gruesome public fight between a husband and wife, and the stakes were terrifyingly simple. Win or die. The idea sounds absurd to modern ears, but it was rooted in the medieval belief that God would grant victory to the innocent. If one partner accused the other of serious wrongdoing, abuse, adultery, abandonment, and there were no witnesses or evidence, the church and local courts sometimes permitted combat to determine who was right. And yes, this included women. Trial by combat might seem like a rare chance at justice for women in a male-dominated world, but, of course, nothing in the Middle Ages was fair. To even the odds, men were often handicapped. In parts of 13th and 14th century Germany, the man would be forced to stand in a waist-deep pit, armed with a club or a stick. His dominant hand might be tied behind his back. He had to strike upward, awkwardly, defensively. The woman? She was given a weapon too, but not a sword, not a blade. She received a rock tied in a cloth, sometimes called a slung sack. She would swing while he would try to jab from the hole, and surrounding them would be a crowd, villagers, judges, clergy, watching the most private of matters be settled in the most violent of ways. If the husband won, the wife was executed, hanged, drowned, or burned, depending on the region. If the wife won, the husband was either put to death or exiled, and she was granted freedom from the marriage. But that freedom came at a price. Even victorious women were often treated as dangerous, unnatural, the medieval mind believed, for having defeated a man in battle. Some were called witches, others were shunned. Their freedom was legal, but never social. Let's take one real case from 1200s Germany. A woman accused her husband of severe cruelty. With no witnesses and no church support, she demanded trial by combat. The duel was approved. He was put in the pit. She circled him, swinging the rock-filled sack. Blow after blow rained down. At one point, he seized her, trying to pull her down into the hole. She broke free. And in a chilling turn, she used her apron strings to strangle him. Yes. She choked her husband to death. In front of a tribunal, priests and villagers. She won. But her community never forgave her. She was viewed as a creature of rage, a woman who had done something outside the limits of femininity. She may have earned her freedom, but she lived the rest of her life as a social outcast. Because in medieval eyes, even a just woman was never supposed to be powerful. Trial by combat wasn't common, but it wasn't mythical either. It existed in legal codes. Some duels were even illustrated in manuscripts, complete with rules, diagrams, and etiquette. And for a society obsessed with honor and divine judgment, the duel was more than a solution. It was a spectacle. It turned private suffering into public entertainment. But let's not forget what it truly was. A final, desperate act. A gamble of life and death. And a chilling reminder that for some medieval women, the only path out of a violent marriage was to become violent themselves. Imagine standing in front of a panel of priests, noblemen, and strangers. You're asked to describe your husband's private parts. His performance in bed. The bruises he left on your arms. The last time he hit you. The last time he touched you. The witnesses who may have heard the screams. Now imagine being told it's still not enough. In the medieval world, even if you didn't have to fight your husband in a duel or survive an exile, trying to legally dissolve your marriage still meant one thing: total humiliation. Every flaw in your private life became a public spectacle. For women, the shame wasn't just an unfortunate side effect. It was a weapon. Society and the church used embarrassment and exposure to discourage even the thought of separation. You want freedom? You must bleed for it. Socially, emotionally, spiritually. And they made sure the entire town would watch you do it. The medieval church had the final word on whether a marriage could be dissolved, and it rarely granted permission lightly. Grounds for annulment or separation were limited: lencpotence, non-consummation, occonsest, which could mean even distant cousins, fraud, flutterim cruelty or abandonment. But proving any of those things meant airing your life in court, and that court wasn't always a private room. In many cases it meant public testimony. Clergy, magistrates, scribes, neighbors, everyone listened. The evidence could be as disturbing as stained bed linens or servant accounts of bedroom conversations. A wife might be asked to describe how her husband failed to perform sexually, or she might be forced to confess to witnesses seeing him drunk and violent. The woman's behavior was also examined. Was she obedient? Did she nag him? Did she deny him sex? Was she quarrelsome? It wasn't just about justice. It was about blame. Because to the medieval mind, a broken marriage had to be someone's fault, and that fault usually rested on the woman. Take, for example, a 14th century English noblewoman, her name lost to history. She sought an annulment after years of childlessness. She swore her husband was sterile. But in court, her husband's family insisted the problem was her womb, not his seed. Midwives were called. Her intimate history was dissected. Her menstrual cycle examined in detail by male clerics. Witnesses came forward to say she'd never been a true wife, meaning she may have denied him. Others suggested God had cursed her. Her petition failed. She returned home in disgrace, still married, childless, and now publicly branded as defective. Her name was whispered in market stalls. Servants gossiped. No one would ever forget the trial. Even if a woman won, if she managed to escape an abusive or neglectful husband, her battle wasn't over. Divorced or annulled women were seen as damaged goods. Her virtue was now complicated, her status uncertain. In most cases, she lost her dowry, the money or land she brought into the marriage, and had little to live on. Nobles might toss her into a convent. Commoners might see her forced into begging. She couldn't easily remarry. Men feared she was difficult or cursed. Other women viewed her with suspicion. After all, if she escaped her husband, could they too? Divorce or annulment didn't free a woman. It marked her. And that's exactly what the church intended. By turning the process into a ritual of shame, they preserved marriage as sacred, even if that sacredness meant lifelong suffering. In the medieval world, the cost of freedom wasn't just high. It was devastating, and for many women, silence and survival were the only alternatives to public disgrace. But for others, they faced a fate even colder than humiliation: confinement. What do you do with a woman who won't obey, who refuses to suffer in silence, who dares to question her husband, or worse, attempts to leave him? In today's world, we might call her independent, brave, even heroic. But in the medieval world, there was another word for her: dangerous. And for dangerous women, there was a solution. You lock them away. In the eyes of medieval law, a wife was not her own person. Upon marriage, her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could no longer own property independently. She couldn't sue. She couldn't make contracts. She was, quite literally, his possession. So when a wife misbehaved, or simply displeased her husband, he had the legal right to confine her. It didn't have to be for a crime. She didn't need to be violent, or adulterous, or mad. All that was required was her husband's disapproval. He could claim she was hysterical. He could say she was endangering his name. And the church, as usual, would rarely intervene, so long as she was housed, clothed, and not killed outright. A noblewoman might be confined to her apartments. A merchant's wife might be locked in a storeroom or cellar. Some were exiled to distant family estates. Others? Sent to convents, whether they wanted to become nuns or not. And for a select few, those who were powerful enough to be considered truly dangerous, they were sealed away in towers. One of the most famous cases of wifely imprisonment in the medieval world is that of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then Queen of England, and one of the most formidable women in European history. Eleanor married King Henry II of England, a union that united vast territories and created a powerhouse dynasty. But Eleanor was no silent consort. She spoke her mind. She acted politically, and when her husband grew cruel and tyrannical, she supported her sons in a rebellion against him. For that, Henry ordered her imprisoned. Not for a week, not a year. 16 years. 16 years of isolation, first in Salisbury Castle, then in various royal fortresses. She was allowed no political contact, no visits from her sons, and was kept under guard. Only after Henry's death did she regain her freedom, and then return to the throne with astonishing resilience. But Eleanor was lucky. She was a queen. She survived. Most women? They simply disappeared. One 14th century woman, known only as Agnes, was the wife of a minor French noble. She was outspoken. She insulted her husband in public, complained of mistreatment, and sought the help of a local priest. Her husband, furious, declared her mentally unstable. She was locked in a room at the back of their estate, windows bricked shut, food passed through a hole in the wall. No charges, no trial. She was never seen again. No one intervened. Because, legally, she was his responsibility and his property. And perhaps most chilling of all, there was no need to lie about it. Imprisoning one's wife was not a secret shame. It was accepted discipline. As long as she wasn't murdered outright, neighbors might turn a blind eye or even approve. In some cases, husbands grew tired of their wives altogether. Divorce being nearly impossible, they turned to a workaround: forced religious life. A woman might be dragged to a convent and persuaded to take vows. Once she became a nun, she was spiritually and legally dead to the outside world. Her marriage was dissolved, not by divorce, but by religion. Of course, she could never remarry. She could never leave. But she was no longer a problem. She was a ghost behind cloistered walls. To silence a woman in the Middle Ages, you didn't need to beat her or kill her. You just had to take away her voice, take away her name, and put her somewhere the world would forget. In the Middle Ages, there was one institution more powerful than kings, queens, and armies combined: the church. And if the church said you were married, you were married. No matter how miserable, no matter how dangerous, no matter how hopeless, even royalty, with all their influence, riches, and armies, could not easily escape the church's grip. If you were trapped in a marriage, no matter how powerful you were, you stayed. Because while kings ruled kingdoms, the church claimed to rule souls. To understand just how powerful the church was, we need to look at its doctrine. Marriage wasn't merely a contract, it was a sacrament, like baptism or communion. It was believed to reflect the union between Christ and the Church, sacred, eternal, and unbreakable. This meant that even adultery, cruelty, or abandonment didn't automatically end a marriage. A woman could be publicly beaten, deprived, even exiled by her husband. And yet, in the eyes of the Church, she remained his wife. Only two paths existed. 1. Annulment, in which the marriage was declared invalid from the beginning. 2. Permanent separation, where you remained legally married but lived apart, with the Church's reluctant permission. But the Church was deeply conservative. It granted annulments rarely, and only when it served religious or political goals. Let's explore what happened when powerful figures begged, pleaded, or schemed to escape their marriages, and failed. Case 1. Juana la Loca, trapped by blood and madness. Juana of Castile, known cruelly to history as Juana la Loca or Joanna the Mad, was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. As a royal bride, she was married off to Philip the Handsome, a powerful and ambitious Habsburg prince. She fell in love with him, obsessively, desperately. But Philip? He was cold, controlling, and unfaithful. Their marriage unraveled into tragedy. When Philip died young, possibly poisoned, Juana's grief became legendary. She clung to his coffin, traveled with it, refused to bury him. But here's where the story turns crueler. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V, declared her mentally unstable. Whether she was truly ill or politically inconvenient, we'll never know. She was imprisoned in a convent in Tordesillas for nearly 50 years. Could she seek an annulment? Could she claim freedom? Not a chance, because the Church had sanctified her marriage, and her madness only made her easier to control. Case 2. Empress Matilda, a widow trapped by religion. Another powerful woman, Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England, faced a different but equally maddening wall. After being widowed from the Holy Roman Emperor at a young age, Matilda was forced to remarry, to Geoffrey of Anjou, a political alliance with a man she barely knew. Their marriage was rocky, loveless, and full of tension. She wanted out. But the Church refused. Once a marriage had been consummated and blessed, it was permanent. The Empress, despite her imperial title, could not escape. She spent years fighting for her right to rule England, while being legally chained to a man she could not stand. The marriage haunted her politically, limiting her movements, her alliances, even her credibility. She bore the title of Empress, but she lived like a prisoner of doctrine. Of course, no medieval divorce story is complete without mentioning Henry VIII, though his reign technically comes after the Middle Ages. His obsessive quest to divorce Catherine of Aragon led to a complete break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. But what's often forgotten is this: he spent 6 years begging the Pope for an annulment. 6 years of political lobbying, bribery, theological debate, and nothing. Not even the most powerful monarch in Europe could bend the Church's will. And so, Henry split from Rome, reshaped religion, and created a personal system where he alone could grant divorces. But for all others, especially women, there was no such luxury. When the Church said no, your world collapsed. You could be a queen, an empress, a grieving widow, or a desperate mother. It didn't matter. If God said you were married, you were married. In a world where divorce was nearly impossible, the medieval mind invented a strange escape hatch, a legal and spiritual loophole that could set a woman free from her marriage without defying the Church's doctrine. It was called annulment. But make no mistake, this was no simple process. This was not divorce by another name. This was a maze of theology, politics, shame, and money. And it was only open to the lucky few. Let's be clear. An annulment didn't end a marriage. It claimed the marriage had never been valid in the first place. To qualify for an annulment, a woman had to argue that the union had been flawed from the beginning, that it was never truly a sacrament, that it had never taken in God's eyes. This could be argued through several narrow criteria. The marriage was never consummated. One party was forced or coerced. Figures of spouses were related by blood or spiritual kinship. One party was already secretly married. That had been fraud or deceit at the time of union. But here's the catch. Proof was everything. And in a world where most women had no legal representation, no documentation, and few allies, proof was often impossible to gather. Even if a woman met the criteria, she still had to fire canon lawyers to represent her before church tribunals, forego, often from among servants or family, forego physical examinations to prove virginity, forego enormous fees in a world where she likely didn't control her own money. All of this could take years, and during that time, she was still considered married. Her husband could still control her property, her home, and her children. She was trapped in limbo. In most cases, annulments were reserved for the rich and powerful, and even then, they often required papal approval. For an ordinary woman to be granted one was as rare as a peasant being knighted. And success didn't mean salvation. Even if she escaped the marriage, a woman who had fought for an annulment was often treated as suspicious, damaged, difficult. She might never remarry. Her family might disown her. Her children, if she had them, could be deemed illegitimate. Let's take the case of Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. At just 12 years old, she was married to Edmund Tudor, a political match. He died soon after, leaving her pregnant and a widow at 13. Despite her noble status, her extreme youth was evident. Today, such a union would be deemed abusive. In medieval terms, it was simply unfortunate. When she remarried years later, Margaret sought an annulment, not of her first marriage, but to her second husband, Thomas Stanley. This was done strategically, to preserve her own political power and maintain independence at court. She succeeded, but only because she was wealthy, connected, and part of the royal bloodline. For a lower-born woman, such a maneuver would have been unthinkable. Contrast that with an unknown woman from 13th century Italy. She had been forced into marriage at 15. Her husband was violent, impotent, and vanished soon after the wedding. She filed for annulment through her local bishop. He dismissed her. She appealed to a regional church court. Denied again. The process dragged for 8 years. Her family grew weary. Her reputation declined. By the time she was finally granted freedom, she was 30, poor, and alone. The annulment had succeeded, legally, but what she lost in the process could never be recovered. Annulment was never about fairness. It was about access, about who had influence, money, allies. And even then, it was risky. If your case failed, you weren't just stuck in your marriage, you were humiliated in the process. People would know your husband couldn't perform, or that you claimed he was cruel, or that your marriage had been a sham. And instead of sympathy, the world often responded with whispers, laughter, shame. For medieval women, annulment offered the dream of freedom. But like all dreams in that era, it came with a price. Only a handful ever reached the exit. Most simply circled the walls of their cage, until time or death finally set them free. If this shocked you, there's more. Because medieval life wasn't just brutal, it was bizarre, complicated, and deeply human. Want to hear about virginity tests, love potions, or what medieval couples did on their wedding night? Subscribe, because next time we're diving even deeper